Hello, elephants in the room. Welcome to another episode of our podcast, the European University Institute Equity, Diversity and Inclusion podcast, where we explore how different factors such as gender and gender identity, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, religion or belief, disability, weight, affect every part of our society, from our places of work to politics, from culture to history, food and everything in between. We will also reflect together with our guests on the intersectionality of these factors, both within the same under-recognized groups presenting these characteristics and in the wider society. This podcast makes all of us part of the conversation because we are all part of the story. My name is Giuseppe Zago. I am the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the EUI. Today with me we have Carla Vitantonio. Carla is a humanitarian worker, author and actress. She has worked as head of mission for international NGOs in North Korea, where she spent 4 years, as well as in Myanmar and Cuba. Her work focuses on humanitarian crisis management, social justice and inclusion. In recognition of her commitment, she was appointed Knight of the Order of the Star of Italy in 2022. At the EUI, she has been a Policy Leader Fellow at the School of Transnational Governance. With Ad Editore, she has published Pyongyang Blues, which has also been adapted into a podcast, Myanmar Swing and Bolero Havana. Carla, I'm very excited to have you here today. Welcome to our podcast.
Hello, thank you.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about your experience as humanitarian aid worker, but also more broadly about coloniality and decoloniality, systems of power, gender dynamics, and how they played a role in your experience and in your many, many lives. Going through your bio, I think it's really impressive how many lives you've lived. And I think, could be more than one person could do in a lifetime. So, as I said, you have been in Pyongyang, you have lived in Cuba, Havana, and also in Myanmar. Can you tell a little bit more to our listeners about how did you end up living in these countries and in these cities?
Thank you. One thing to say, I come from a past of social activism. Social activism has been the trademark of my life, of my many lives, as you say. However, at around 30, I was living out of theater. I was living with my activity as performer. And I was a little bit the performer of the movement. So my theater was a theater that was denouncing, that was exposing dynamics, that was already looking at dynamics that rotate around the idea of power, distribution and use and misuse. And at around 30, I realized that that was not enough, and that maybe this was not anymore my way. Demonstrations were okay, but I needed to do something different. And so I had already a foot in international development and humanitarian assistance because I had left already several times for what we call short mission. And so I decided to take a master in diplomacy and international relations and to start full-time the career of humanitarian. So now I won't disclose the secret of how I managed to arrive to Pyongyang because I wrote a book on this. So I'm not going to say it in 2 words because it took me 400 pages. But the reality is that many of the things that I did, and maybe I would do again, but maybe not with the intentions that I had 15, 16 years ago. Because and here, we go immediately in the dynamic of what we are going to talk about today. I think that many of us, when we depart and we want to become humanitarian professionals, we are moved by something that we call good feelings, but these good feelings oftentimes are filled with white saviorism and, at the end of the day, with coloniality. So there are still good motivations to go and start this career. But if I think of me, I have not skimmed completely already all my motivations and reasons. And I don't know how much the good feeling of the white savior were present in me when I made this decision.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? So what do you mean by white saviorism for those who are not familiar with the term? And
yes.
If you can say a little bit more how it applied to you specifically?
First of all, we have to make a disclaimer. When we speak in these dynamics, when we speak about whiteness, we are not speaking of the color of the skin. We are speaking about a system of power and rules that derives from the colonial one. And in the colonial one, people with white skin, Europeans, were the people that held the power and that were considered normal. So when we speak about whiteness, we speak about the replication of a system where a certain group of people has the same privileges that the white people in the colonial era had. These people, most of the times, are still white-skinned. But we cannot say so. For example, in Italy, when I am 46, almost 47 years old, and I come from the very south rural Italy, when I was a child, we were not considered white. Even though my skin is whiter than yours, I was not white. In fact, I was considered a Northern African by many, and I was patently discriminated when I moved to the north as somebody inferior. Let's not forget that in Italy, in Turin, there is a museum with the skulls of people from the south of Italy that scientists were studying to see if they were humans enough. So when we speak about whiteness, it's too easy to say you're white, you're brown, you're black. Whiteness is a system of powers and privilege that replicates the colonial system. And most of the time, white people are still in power. I'm looking now at our editor, Valentina. She's white-skinned, but I'm sure that she experienced the migration vulnerabilities of a person that is not white when she moved to Spain. No? So is she white or not? And it's also a feeling, because I feel white in Cuba. Mm-hmm. I feel white and privileged because of my passport. I don't necessarily feel as white in Germany as my white fellows. So let's go back to whiteness. So white saviorism stays in this framework of coloniality, and it is the feeling of the traditionally white people, European and Northern American at that time, now we have also others, that felt that they were blessed by God and by nature in having more, in having the best civilization. And for this reason, they felt like the priests, the first famous one, Bartolomeo de las Casas, that goes to the America and saves the poor indigenous, inferior subhumans. I'm using these very violent words on purpose because that's the feeling. Behind white saviorism, there is the conception, the belief that we are superior. But this belief does not say that if we are superior, it's because we are stealing. We are robbing, we are violating. This superiority, we are not blessed with resources because God gave us. We are blessed with resources because we steal them in Congo, in Yemen, in, name them. So white saviorism is this, the belief that we have more, and because we are good people, we have to give more and to save the others. Of course, this belief is intrinsically racist because it hides and puts a veil on all the abuses that our ancestors and some of us still perpetrate to be in this situation of supposed superiority.
Wow, that's really enlightening as a reading of the dynamics of power, really, that we don't reflect too much about, I think, sometimes. And I was thinking also at discussions we had at the Institute about actions to promote cultural or racial diversity, but there is a conflation, as you were saying, with the concept of being white as white in terms of the color of your skin, but it's much more complex than that. So going back to your own experience, if you like sharing, I was wondering if your thought or your awareness of these power dynamics evolved from your first missions to the most recent ones, and if you developed some practices to challenge these power dynamics, which are very embedded in the way we move in the world. So it's very difficult, I think, to deconstruct them or to challenge them sometimes.
Yes, so much so that I left my job. So much so that now that I'm talking, I resigned from my job as country director from one of the 10 biggest NGOs in the world, exactly because I don't want to be part of this dynamic anymore, at least not in the way I was part of this. So of course, as we say, when we depart, I'm sure that if I speak with all the young people that in the global minority or global north, call it as you like, go to do a master in development, they all want to depart because they are full of good feelings. But where is this good feeling sitting in our consciousness? It's sitting in the same place where white saviorism and coloniality are sitting, because very few of us depart in the name of solidarity. So for me, the key is exactly this. In these 15 years, I developed the idea that the only reason why we try to improve the situation of our kin is because we know that there's no freedom if we are not all free. And you see how different this is from the idea that I save you because I'm better.
Very different.
That's the difference between white saviorism and solidarity. And in this, I also want to say that the academic definition of solidarity in English differs slightly from the definition in Italian or in Spanish. And in fact, I rather speak about solidaridad than solidarity. But this is not a linguistic class, but solidarity is for me exactly also this. I am moved today by solidarity, feeling that I cannot enjoy my freedom if the person around me is not as free as I am. Because if so, that's privilege. If in order to be free and to be able to enjoy my rights, I need to withdraw rights from another person, or I need somebody else to be in a situation that is not sustainable, then this is not a right, this is a privilege. Unfortunately, this is not what we thought when we departed first. And I'm sure, I bet that if I go to the master in diplomacy, in the international development, in Bologna, in Pavia, in Manchester, they will all say, that they want a better world. But they start from a position of privilege. They would like the others to have what they have. Are we really ready to share? Are you really ready to give up your iPhone or whatever? So my idea of this job has changed in time, and what I did, I think, two things inside the system. Inside the system, I specialized in working in partnership, in fair partnership, so where the external agent, the international NGO, the international actor, is only doing things that for some reason the local partner cannot do, and local partners can do way more than we think that we like to say. So work on partnership and work also to advocate with donors, because donors are, I'm sorry to say, but most of donors are super racist. They want international actors to be present because they are their agent, so they can control, they can make sure that accountability and compliance are made in the way that donors like, without respect for the culture and the situation of the hosting country. So anyway, these things, working internally to transform the dynamic of international aid into a fairer and a more just dynamic of partnership, where the international agent is only doing what the national agent cannot do. And also internally trying to brief my staff, to train my staff. So in my country office, this is the way we call them, we practice inclusive leadership. Sometimes we even manage to practice feminist leadership. I really tried to bring the idea of a different way to work and to share power into the country office. Externally, I speak about it whenever I can, and also I have my podcast that is called Living Decoloniality, that speaks with practitioners, policymakers and activists around the world about this, and asks them not to complain, because we have enough about complaining, but to give us their practices so that we can get inspired. Of course, this has consequences. One consequence is that, for example, in my case, my headquarters were not happy with me anymore because they are continuously challenged.
What do you mean by that? So they were not happy because...
Because whenever they send a process, I look at this process and I unveil the fact that this process is intrinsically discriminatory against our fellows in the hosting country, in Cuba, in Myanmar, in Pyongyang. No, for example, I ask the question, would you ask a Canadian colleague to provide you with this accounting document with the same detail that you ask a Cuban colleague? No, you wouldn't, because you are convinced that Cubans are intrinsically corrupt, while corruption in Canada is just something that happens every now and then. This is a double standard. It's racist, because if we go and check Canada, to say Canada, it's a very corrupted place, where corruption is embedded into politics, into the system, as much as Italy, as much as Cuba maybe, or whatever else country, no? So as activists of solidarity, we learn that we need to challenge these dynamics when they are happening. If I am in a panel and a man is not letting me speak, I stop this panel and I ask everybody to bear witness that I'm being discriminated in this moment. This is what we are taught. But then when we do it, we became the real elephant in the room, or as a famous feminist says, the troublemakers. When I stop this dynamic, nobody, oh no, let's not talk to Carla, she's so heavy, she cannot take a joke. She always needs to ruin the party. Yes. So, and that's why I resigned, because I have a life to live. And also, it's not my duty to train all my headquarters. And there's only that much that one person can do. I know that I'm not alone, but it's very difficult, huh?
No. I totally understand, in the sense that I think it goes back, what you're saying, it goes back to the dynamics also of the workplace. I mean, humanitarian aid, country offices are a very specific type of work environment, but I think what you're saying can be replicated also in other places of work. And it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about the systemic forms of coloniality, and the fact that I'm thinking about EDI as well, like equity, diversity, and inclusion and how it is often applied or performed looking at the individual, but then there is also the systemic framework that really makes the lives of people who speak up difficult because they're left alone in a way many times, or they are considered like the troublemakers, as you were saying.
Can I say one thing going off track?
Please.
So that's the victory of neo-capitalism. Our system killed activism by letting us believe that every action that we take needs to be individual. But activism is not individual. Boycotting works if we are all boycotting. If I only am boycotting, it does not work. So activism works because it's collective. So that's really, when I was a young person, mass movements were the norm. Now, if you see a demonstration, 90% of the times there will be the police that will try to beat the people. So there's a criminalization of collective action, but collective action is the root of activism. First thing first. Second thing, as you say, the individual is very important, but it's also the simplest because we can all learn on our own. It's very easy. And in fact, when I do my training, I always try to say there are at least 3 levels. The individual, which is legitimate and important. Then there's the structure. In this case, it would be the EUI. No, that's the work that you do, trying to change your internal structure where you have a direct impact. And then there's a third level. That's the system. So you need to intertwine these 3 systems, these 3 levels, if you want to bring change about. Individuals on their own are just molecules. So you don't build a system like this. But then, there are all these famous studies. There's one study that is even mentioned in the EUI that is about...
Would you like to say a little bit?
Yes,
I'm familiar with it, but if you want to say more.
The 3.5%. It's a very interesting study made by Erika Chenoweth that, if I'm not wrong, is at Harvard. So is a very recognized and respected scholar. And she studied movements of solidarity and of liberation of the past. And she identified that if 3.5% of the population of a country gets active in a movement of solidarity, this movement will be successful. That's fantastic because 3.5% is very little. Of course, things change because now movements are made differently. There's the virtual, there's the Instagrammers. But apparently she's still working on this. And apparently this 3.5% more or less still stands. So this is rewarding, no? Because 3.5% it's easily reachable.
Yeah, it's encouraging actually, yes. If it was like 25%, it would already be more depressing.
And so to close this, yes, so I think that, as you said, the individual is important. We need to train the individual. The individual is the base. But then there's the structure. That's what individuals do in the structure. They have a direct impact. And you have impact in many structures, in your family, in your workplace, in your municipality, because entering politics is also about this, no? Mm-hmm. Voting. and then influencing the system. That's what you do with boycotting, with joining general campaigns, with activism. But this is, I would say, our duty of citizens.
No, I agree. And not to be the down player here, but I'm also realizing my impression is that it's becoming more and more difficult. One of the reasons I think it's because of the neoliberal system, as you were mentioning. I'm also thinking at the context we are living here right now, also with the rise of the far-right movements in Europe and not only in Europe, with the election of Donald Trump for a second term. I was wondering if you think there are other factors or other actions that we could do differently. I'm thinking about this because this became sort of a theme that emerged spontaneously in our podcast for the past months. So reflecting on EDI, but not only on EDI, but there is a backlash when it comes to collective action, to solidarity, and if we want to think of a more organizational point of view in the D&I initiatives. And I don't know if you have some thoughts on this.
I have thoughts, but I don't think they are especially original, so I don't want to waste a lot of time on this. I think, of course, this is not a nice moment to be alive on this world. I'm very proud to say I was the first person to bring the word polycrisis to the EUI 1 year ago. Now I see that there are also trainings on, but we are living a polycrisis. So there's no one factor that affects this. There's a series of factors, and some of them originated in the 2000s. There's a line with the Genova Social Forum of 2001 where the idea of globalization won, with everything that globalization brings, the good and especially the bad, and the criminalization of the collective global movement for civil rights. That's one of the things. So I think we cannot have one solution for a problem that is compound. If we are facing a polycrisis, we have to have polysolution. So we have to act on several fronts. But one front is really collective. What I notice is that many organizations don't push back. When Trump started to push on universities in the United States, only few reacted.
True.
Organizations don't push back enough. And I have only recently, I am moving back to Europe, so I don't know well enough the situation in Europe, but my feeling is that organizations don't push back a lot. And that's sad, because again, individuals are only a little part, and the organizations, then I don't want to say things that everybody knows, but an organization is more than the sum of the individuals. An organization is something that can have more weight, but no, organizations don't push back enough. That's an issue. And when individuals organize and push back, they are usually punished for this. So this is also difficult. But this goes behind in a trend that is about 25 years old, and that is exactly the criminalization of civil activism together with the securitization of many issues that are not about security. Migration is not a security issue. Migration is something that is typical of the human being. It's not a security issue. The human being wants to stay better. Migration is something that is proper of every human being. So now we leave it as a security issue. The fact that the young people have the need to explore sexually and emotionally is in part of the human nature, and so they need education. This is not a security issue.
Of course. It makes me think of the fact that boundaries, like borders, are quite a recent thing. They didn't exist until, I don't want to say something wrong, but not many centuries ago, let's say, there weren't any boundaries. It's probably a 19th century invention, right? So,
and in many countries, the boundaries, we built them. If you look at the way the African continent is built, it's built with a square and with a rule and a pencil on a map. If you look at the two Koreas, they have been divided on the 38th parallel by General MacArthur with a pencil. That's the border, but this is not their border.
I'm not sure. I think I'm going to shift a little bit topic, but maybe it's related. But I think you were talking about human relations and exploring also sexually or sentimentally, and how this is not a security issue. This made me think, again, I'm not sure if it's a particularly effective connection, but it made me think about the places you've lived in. So Pyongyang, Havana, places that are quite extreme in some ways. It's not easy to live in a place like that, especially, if you are
a queer woman. Yes, I know.
Yeah. And I think there is this theme, at least in Bolero Havana, I noticed this theme of relationships with the other, which links with this complex of the white savior, as you were saying at the beginning, but it's also something more than that, at least from what I interpreted your reading and your writing. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, what these experiences taught you, if they taught you anything about relationship and how to relate with the other.
Yes. I will say one thing that goes a little bit off track, but I want to say it and then maybe you can cut it. You know that until Blaise Pascal, we were not conscious that we were thinking while we were thinking. So Blaise Pascal is the first Western philosopher. I say Western philosopher because maybe in China they already knew it, that realizes the threat of thought, that you never stop thinking. And that's why meditating is so difficult. And you know why I think about this? Because you said, do you have thoughts? And I was like, yes, I do have. While you're saying, I never stopped thinking. We never stopped thinking. And so othering, this is the process of looking at the others and at the other in front of you, and consciously or unconsciously deciding to let the difference prevail over similarities. Othering is looking at the other in front of you and saying, is he or she is not like me. Othering is also creating a feeling of superiority. The other is usually the enemy, or recently in our sector, the victim. Othering can also be, for a white savior, is very, very often victimizing the other, withdrawing their capacity, their agency. And that's why, for example, I worked a lot in the humanitarian mine action. What we do is going and try to demine places that were mined during the war. And people that survive from the mines, they don't call them victim of mines. They call themselves mine survivor. There's a movement also in survivors of sexual abuse. We are not victims, we are survivors. It's not just a word. There's a very famous Italian director, Nanni Moretti, that always says words mean a lot, words are important. That's an old movie called Bianca. I don't know if you were, Words mean a lot. Victim and survivor are not the same. Othering is a process. It's a very difficult process to identify because it's often naturalized. You look at the other and you have two options. You look at something that is like you, and that's empathy or solidarity. And that you look at something and it's different from you, and that's the other, the enemy or the victim. And othering is what we continuously do, not only in the realm of racism, not only in humanitarian action. We do it continuously. We do it, for example, when we look at migration, when we look at all the continuum of gender. That's it. When it's naturalized and we don't think about it, it's dangerous. And that's why we want to unveil this dynamic. Not because we want to teach people how to be bad people, but because we want them to realize what's happening. In the moment you other someone, you're withdrawing their agency. You don't recognize them as having the same rights that you have. So yes, that's a dangerous process, and it happens continuously, even among us. In August, I was part of an aggression, a lesbophobic, homophobic aggression in the station of Padova. I was going on my bicycle. I was very well dressed. I was dressed like a lady, contrary to my usual, because I was going to a working meeting. Yes, it's true, my head was shaved. And yes, it's true, I had a backpack with a very small rainbow flag. I was on my bicycle and I hear a lady, a white lady, patently with an accent of the very city I was in, shouting at me, "Go home, go home." And my first feeling was like, this lady is wrong because I'm like her. What? How can she may be unwell? So I stopped because in my stupid mind, I wanted to elaborate and to let her understand that, I was like her. And when I stopped, she got even more angry and she started to shout at me, "You bloody lesbian, go home, we don't want you here." And in this moment, I thought, this lady learned that I am the enemy. That's the real issue for me in this moment. Well, I escaped. I managed not to be touched physically by her. But for me, this is a very patent othering process. The othering process makes you feel entitled to defend yourself and your country and your family from the enemy. I was going on from my own business, but she thought I was the enemy. I was a danger. So the othering process is something that, as you say, far rights are using very often in the way they use, for example, media.
They're very skilled in that, right? It's something that probably we should reflect more on how effective they are in spreading these messages. And it goes back, I think, to what you were saying about language and what Nanni Moretti used to say about language, and the fact that, at least in Italy, in the political debate, it's often ridiculed, the fact that advocates or feminist movements or simply people who are experts in a given field, they deeply care about language and how language can evolve to be more representative of the world outside. And I lost count of the time I read or I listened to people saying, "Oh, but why do you care about language?" Well, it's just performative. It's not. I mean, it's quite important, right?
If you are not present in the law, so if you are not recognized as a subject, how can you have rights? If the law is protecting cats, dogs, but not ducks, if the law is saying cats can drive, dogs can drive, and does not say anything about ducks, can ducks drive? Or can't they drive? And if a police stops a duck, what should they do? So if a dog sees a duck driving, are they entitled to kill the duck because allegedly they are doing something that is not correct? So language is not simply performative. Language is about law and rights. And we should be very careful. And that's the famous executive order of the 31st of January of Donald Trump about gender, naming gender as a false ideology and binary FM as masculine, feminine, as objective truth. This is a deliberate linguistic maneuver, which is very dangerous.
I'm thinking also it's a COP30, the climate conference that is taking place in these days, and there is a debate around the word gender and how some groups within the conference, they want to go back to define it as biological sex.
That's coloniality of gender. Let's be clear about this. Gender is a social construct. this is also, you can find it on the WHO website. It's not Carla Vitantonio, it's a social construct that changes from culture to culture. And that is about how your physiological and biological attributes define what you can do or cannot do in a society. That's gender. This is something that was developed in the global minority. In some other culture, gender norms are different, but in some other culture, gender is not a thing. Gender does not exist. In the Yoruba culture, Nigeria, before the British invasion, gender norms were not relevant for the definition of what a biological female or a biological male was allowed to do in their daily life. If you read Oyewumi Oyerunke, she's a famous Nigerian scholar, Yoruba scholar, that wrote a beautiful book called The Invention of Gender. She speaks about this. So, coloniality of gender means exactly that we go somewhere else as Westerners, let's use this term, and we expect to find there the same representation of the relation between biology and society that we have in our country. And if we do not find it, we apply it anyway. That's what we did when we colonized. For example, in Bolivia, the gender norms of Bolivia were often very oppressive against women. So what we did when we went to colonize Bolivia, we used this gender norm to give power to those who had more power because it was comfortable for us. But in countries where this did not exist, we imposed our rules. There's plenty of writings on this. Yes. So, and also there are many, many more cultures than used to think where gender is naturally considered a continuum. A continuum where the ideal opposite are the ideal male and the ideal female. But between these two ideals, there's many other things. I think very often we think about the two spirits. There's a beautiful writing from the Zapatista that speak about the fact that they understand that some people don't feel female or male. But there is also a very beautiful story from very close to us, Albania. In Albania, some women were allowed to take the identity of a man and to do things that were traditionally from men if certain conditions were respected. Frankly, I don't know now if in Albania this is still possible, but this is part of their ancestral culture.
There is a beautiful book, I know the Italian title, I don't know the English title, which is called Vergine Giurata, and it's exactly about this.
And it's not very far from us. In Napoli, we have the tradition of the Femminillo. The Femminillo is not the clown. It's an identity. Curzio Malaparte speaks about the Femminillo during the occupation of the US of the south of Italy in 43-45. So gender is something that is deeply entrenched with cultures, and it's much more complicated than MF.
It makes me think also of other characteristics, for example, homosexuality as well. In some African states, homosexuality was not. I think they didn't name it, and then through colonization, it became pathologized. And
that's the same in Japan or in Korea. Because, so here we're talking about sexual preferences and not necessarily about gender identity. For example, in Korea, in the Koryo dynasty, it was normal that the nobles, men, had sexual preferences that were with people of the same sex, as much as in the ancient Rome. This did not mean that their gender identity was challenged. They were still the king or the queen. They were still able to fulfill their reproductive duty. So that was about sexual preferences. That was a private matter in cultures like the Confucian culture in Korea or the Shintoist culture, where the private space was something super private and did not have anything to do with the reproductive public, because the reproductive duty is public. It's about the motherland. So this was a division. When there's the mixture, the meeting, the encounter, and even the occupation from the West, then this becomes pathologized. In many countries, we have the same thing.
So are we going back to what you were saying before about partnerships in the way we ideally we do solidarity, we create solidarity movements, and does this apply also to law ideally? So instead of imposing legal provisions or pathologizing dynamics that were already present in these countries, should we?
So according to the Paris Compact, every country is sovereign. So every country establishes their own legal framework. And if they sign international framework, as they do, about human rights, the Declaration, the Children's Rights, the CEDAW, they should abide by these principles through their legal framework. It is true that there's a double standard also in this. When we go to several countries in Africa, we do a lot of legal support to the governance system to democratize their legal framework. Is this legitimate? Yes, no, I don't know. I think that this is instrumental. Most of the partnerships that work on this, they work because there's a lot of money that goes there. So most of the countries that accept all these OECD specialists and consultants that go and change the legal framework and support the change of the legal framework. Some of them maybe do it with the best intention, but there's also a flow of money that we cannot ignore. So when we go to law, that's very challenging because most of the countries where, for example, homosexuality is criminalized are countries that were former colonies and whose governance and political system are a mirror of the former colonial power. This was not their form of political organization. So you cannot erase. We cannot just say, okay, so now let's erase everything and let's go back from scratch and everybody has the system that the EU had before. This is impossible. So it's impossible to do this, and therefore it's difficult to say what they should do or what we should do. I think that we should think more domestically and get less worried about what the others are doing. As Europeans, we should get extremely worried by the fact that our legal frameworks are becoming increasingly restrictive and preach less about saving Africa. We have an issue in Europe, huge issues with rights, and preach less about Venezuela, about Cuba, they have their own problems. But I think that we should care more about our big issues, big domestic issues.
We definitely do have many big issues. Exactly.
I'm not saying that we should not care about the others. I'm saying that this is also a form of coloniality and a form of racism. Going to save them, to put them in place, to create a nice legal framework, but we cannot set the example. And in fact, all the beautiful European Union document about gender justice are based on one concept: walk the talk. That's the concept that we tend to forget. Walk the talk means you cannot go to Colombia and preach gender justice if your office is an office where women are systematically abused and harassed. And I'm saying this because, there's a big scandal undergoing now with a big Western agency where there are several denounces of harassment and the person accused was not even relieved from duty. He's still there. So the European Union says, walk the talk. This is the basis of all the frameworks on gender justice in Europe. And I think that's maybe the trick. Okay, let's do international solidarity. Let's do development. Let's do cooperation. But let's walk the talk. Let's only teach you what we're really doing. That's extreme, but I think we should think about it every now and then.
Yeah, and probably step down from our pedestals that we built from ourselves, right? So I think we touched upon so many issues and I have thousands of other questions. I think we should invite you again, Carla, for another episode of the podcast. But I have a curiosity about the titles of your books. It's really not related. I don't know. I don't think it's related with all we discussed now, but you use dance.
Yes,
and a music reference for the titles of your books, and I thought it was very beautiful, and I was wondering if there is a reason behind it.
So the 3 books are called Pyongyang Blues, Myanmar Swing, and Bolero Havana. So there's an instrumental, a functional reason, but there's also an emotional reason that, has to do with us today. The functional reason is that when I did Pyongyang Blues, the book was a success. And everybody, I was going in tour and everybody was telling me, I was in Myanmar when I toured with the first book. So everybody was asking me, and so now how are you going to call your next book? The Rock from Yangon, the Rumba from Havana. So this was an expectation. So it became very clear to the editor at that time that I would do a trilogy and that this trilogy would have fil rouge that would be music. So this was the instrumental reason. And then the inner reason has to do with the fact that I try to be in contact with my feelings when I do my work. So I try to be honest. And while I do my work, I'm also living. I just said I'm almost 47 years old. I spent, I would say, the last part of my youth and my reproductive age in countries that were not my own countries, where I was on my own and I had a lot of time to think, but also a lot of time to look at human solitude and to observe what I was doing. For example, my leadership practices. So most of the things that I am able to say today that maybe I would not say tomorrow, so even this podcast is very volatile,
we are fluid.
Are the harvest of a lot of reflection on myself. That's one of the few scientific articles that I wrote that is called Reflexivity and Coloniality, Reflexivity and Do No Harm. I think that the humanitarian worker and the researcher should always practice reflexivity. What does it mean? You have to look where you are, to look at the impact of the fact that you are occupying a space, and to understand how you manage to interact with this. The space is not something that you observe from above. This is a very colonial belief. When you enter in a space to do research, when you enter in a space to provide aid, you change this space. Because it's physics. The molecules move. So reflexivity means exactly this. So I reflected a lot, and most of the things that I say are the harvest of this very not perfect reflection. And reflection comes better when there is the music. So these three styles, blues for North Korea, swing for Myanmar, and bolero for Cuba, are really the three music styles that not only I listen to, but that for me are closer to the feeling that I had in this country. And that for DPRK is a feeling of forever melancholy. When you are in DPRK, you know that every day is the last day, because it's so difficult to enter there that, it's not a place where you say, in 10 years I will go back on holiday. It's forever a loss. So it's a blues. When I was in Myanmar, it was the years of democracy. We did not know it was only for 5 years that we had a semi-democracy there. So it was a swing. It was very active, very upbeat, still with a little bit of past, but it was looking forward. And with Cuba, I would not like to disclose too much, because there's a chapter of the book that speaks about the bolero, and especially about a female singer called Maria Teresa Vera. She was the daughter of a Lucumi slave in Cuba, and she wrote one of the most beautiful boleros of the world, that is 20 años. So that's the song for me, the style for Cuba. In this moment, I'm not listening to music.
Okay. I don't know if I can ask you why, but maybe.
I'm in a moment of transition. I'm trying to move back to Europe, and I'm at loss. And also, devices have changed very much. While I was lost in these countries, the 4G arrived, 5G arrived, WhatsApp. When I left, there was the MP3 was the new entry. I was having my MP3s on my computer and some CDs, and this was the way we would listen to music. Now, this is like back to future. I'm here, and people have these things like Spotify, all these devices. Then you don't use Spotify because you boycott, and then you have an alternative. So I'm at loss. I don't know where to find music and how to use music. So let's see what happens when I get acquainted.
So let's take a pause and let's see what your new space can bring you. Well, thank you. That's really a very beautiful reflection, Carla. Thank you for sharing it with us. And sometimes we're so immersed in our own things and our deadlines, our projects, and we don't take time to pause. Or at least I speak for myself. I should take more time to pause and see what's around. So thank you. I really enjoyed this, you sharing this thought. So I think we're at the end of our podcast today, and we usually ask our guests to suggest readings or music or movies that they have watched recently and they want to or not recently, and they want to share with our listeners. You shared a lot of resources and but
maybe something.
But if you have something more that you want to share,
one little advertisement. Please listen to my podcast, Living the Coloniality, 3 seasons in English, and starting from Thursday, November 20th, also in Spanish. But then there's a few things I would like to recommend, actually. There's a movie that is called Memorias del Subdesarrollo. I think it's subtitled in English, Memories of Underdevelopment. It's a Cuban movie from 1961. And I think it's a movie that everybody should watch. That's the movie I would like to recommend. But also a movie that is very recent, Nanni Moretti, Il Sol dell'Avvenir. I also think it's a movie for a big reflection, a movie that asks us to look beyond the individual. Very, very interesting movie. I cried. I cried. And as a book, unfortunately, I'm not reading many, many books, but I would like to recommend the work of a collective from Colombia that is called Pluriversa. And they are designers and architects. And they work on decolonizing design. And they are not hippies. When we think about this, we tend to think about people that go around hugging trees. Besides that, hugging trees is not a bad practice and we should all do it more. But they're real serious professionals that work on industrial design, on design, and look at how design can be decolonized. Design as something that is made by men, by the human being, for the use of human being. So I would deeply recommend the work of Pluriversa. Pluriversa.org.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you for joining us and stopping by. And thank you to our elephants in the room, and see you soon.
Thank you. It was a privilege.